You folks ready to start? Let's do this. Get this back underway. I'm surprised so many people are here. Always, right? The lectures are recorded, and apparently a good half of the class realizes that. You guys haven't gotten the message, because did you notice how many people were here on Thursday of last week? That's how many people are enrolled in this class. So at least half of you are staying at home. But for those of you who are here, I'll try not to spit on you too much today. We'll do what I can to make this as fun as possible. But welcome back. Thanks for coming back after that first test. Let's talk about that test a little bit before we get to work talking about thermodynamics, which is the main topic at hand. But I got some good news for you guys. Here's the breakdown that we got for the scores for that first test. Let me shout out to you, the best news I have is the average is 72.72%, right? What does that mean to you guys? It sounds C-ish, right? Well, here's what that means to me. Compare that to that bottom parentheses at the bottom there. The last time I taught this class in the fall of 2013, the average was 64.18%. And I think it's a test of very similar difficulty to the one that you have. So you guys are awesome. All right? You guys did better on that first test than any group I've ever had take that test before. So whatever else you got going on, you're really good at biology. Keep it up. All right? That's like, 8% higher. That's huge. So good job. And I've been doing all sorts of things this year to see if I couldn't drive that average up. And you're giving me the idea that some of that stuff might be working. I think the main thing that I've been trying to impress upon you is look at the old tests. I always say that every time I teach this class. If you look at the integrity recordings from 2012 and 2013, you'll see that I was saying it then too, but I think I've been particularly pointed in encouraging you to do that this year. So keep it up. Look at those old tests. And to help make that point, you'll remember that 2 weeks into the class, about 2.5, 3 weeks ago now, I sent an email out to everybody. Everybody got an email, and there were two kinds of emails that went out. There were those that said, hey, good job for looking at that folder that has the first exam in it. And there was the email that went out saying, like, hey, you should probably look at that folder that has the first exam in it, right? I can't tell how long you've been looking at the folder, but I can tell if you clicked on it from what Pilot is tracking. For the students who looked at it before I sent out that email, their average was 79.3%, compared to the class average of 72.7%. So my point now is simply this: the sooner you look at those old exams, the better, right? So start right away. What you might want to do, I think if you just looked at the second exam tonight, it would probably be a help to you. An awful lot that you would see in that second exam from the last couple of years would be kind of confusing, because I'm going to be using words that we haven't talked about yet to this point in the class. But even still, I think that would help you, because then during the course of the lecture, when I use those words, it'll occur to you, hey, wait a minute, he's going to ask a question about this at some point. Maybe this is one of those times that I should make a note or pay a little extra attention. So even if you don't know what the questions are about, I think looking at those old tests might help. But even better, maybe take a look at some of those old recordings, like the 2012 or the 2013 integrity recordings that are also available on Pilot, and then take a look at those those old exams, and then listen to me prattle on about all that stuff again. Boy, that's got to be a formula for success. So the sooner you look at those old tests, the better. And I think you might even find looking at the old lectures will help you when you're looking at the old tests. So good job. There were 2 people who got a perfect score. so 45 out of 45. Both of those people happen to have been among those who were in the group that looked at the first exam before I sent the email prompting people to look at the first exam. So another sign that that's a helpful thing to do. The low score was 11 out of 45. I don't know. You know, that's less than if there are only 4 or 5 choices per question, right? And so I'm thinking by chance people should get like 12 or 13. So, you know, if you're not happy with how you did on that first exam, if you're on the low side of the average, let's work that out, right? Let's talk, stop by, see me, go to the supplemental instruction sessions. Let's see if we can't figure out what didn't work out. And I got some good news for you. The first exam, like the second exam, is worth only 90 points out of 400 for the class. So there's still time to salvage a reasonably good grade out of it if you're not happy with how you did on the first test. But I don't want to make people feel badly, but I think you need a dose of reality in some sense too. Knowledge is power. If you're not happy with how you did on the first test, it has been my experience that the way students do on the first test is very predictive of how they'll do on the second and the third. Right? I've looked over the years, and there's a very high correlation between a student's final grade and the grade they got on the first test. So if you don't like how things worked for you on the first exam, don't think that it's all just going to come together for you on the second and the third. We need to have maybe an intervention, a sit down, a chat. Let's work out a strategy to help you get a different outcome. Don't think it's all just going to straighten itself out without you doing something differently. Because for better or worse, I imagine, I can't change. And the kind of questions that I'm going to ask you and the way that I talk about things in lectures, those are unlikely to change between now and the second test. We need to see what we can do to help you work within my disabilities and help you wrestle with things so that you can do better on the next test. So again, if you don't like the grade that you got, let's work on it. Talk with me, talk with Lauren, the supplemental instructor, and let's see if we can straighten things out. But with that sort of sad commentary, again, good job. Boy, that's an awesome average for the first test. I think this is going to be a class that I'm going to look back at fondly over the years and say, why can't you guys be like the 2015 Bio 1120 class? What's wrong with you folks? All right? About the test itself. Some of you may be wondering, some of you may not have thought to wonder. Let me just lay bare some of the details about what was happening during that test. From my perspective, I think it was question 23. Let me take a look just to be sure. There was a problem with one of the formulas that I had written out by hand. So, no, it wasn't 23, 22. So what I was looking for the right answer for that one was D. It turns out that wasn't a properly drawn chemical formula. And so just to assuage any problems, to mitigate any problems that I was going to have with trying to get people to pick something that couldn't exist in nature as the right answer, whatever you chose for 22 counted as the right answer. Right? So there was no wrong answer for question 22. That's already factored into your score. And then many of you noticed that question 41 and 43 were strikingly similar. I don't know, beer maybe? I really don't know how that happened. It looked to me at the time like, boy, this is sweet. I have just the right mix of questions on each of the different topics, and they're right next to each other, and I missed that. And so anyway, you got double quizzed on one particular point. That was not intentional on my part entirely, but nonetheless, I don't think that it compromised the test in any way. It just maybe gave a little more emphasis to that one fine point that DNA is in the nucleus than I would have chosen to have done otherwise. So nonetheless, that's what was up with 41 and 43. For those of you who had a yellow test, I have no idea what was going on with the copying there. What I'll do, I've had so many bad experiences with getting exams copied in the past, that what I'll do is I'll pick out random tests, right? And I'll look all the way through, make sure that all the pages are there, that all the questions are there. Apparently, I didn't pull out a yellow one. I looked at a blue, a green, and a pink, and everything looked fine with those. And so off we went, handing them all out. And the copying on the yellow ones, the hand-drawn structures, was subpar. And so if you were having a problem with that, I hope that we've been able to take care of that for you by letting you look at some better copies or just giving you a better exam to work with. So my apologies for those of you who got a yellow. Here's where I'm laying something bare to you. There were 4 different colors to the exam. There were 2 different names to the exam. There was A1 and B2. The only difference between A1 and B2 is the order of the first 2 questions. Right? Everything else about those tests was exactly the same. And the first 2 questions both had E as the correct answer. So the answer key is the same that we graded for all of them. So it really didn't matter which pile you put your test in for this particular exam. They were all the same. Many of you emailed me or called me or visited me to express concern about having not put your exam in the right pile. You don't have to worry about that. That was a learning exercise, right? I wanted to do that to train you all. So again, I see these exams as a chance to teach, right? Part of what I was doing was teaching you guys how to take these tests in these massive rooms. The next exam, coming up in what, the beginning of November, the next exam, make sure you put your test in the right box. You know how to do that now, right? So there may not be different colors to the exam, but there may be different versions to the exam. Make sure when you turn your exam in the next time that you put it in the proper box, okay? All right, any questions for me about this first test? Somebody's going to be wanting to know. You're being shy, you're being polite, maybe, I'm not sure which. Somebody's going to want to know, so are you going to use a curve? Are you going to grade on a curve, right? Everybody wants to know. That always comes up. I will not grade on a curve for an individual test, right? But at the end of the semester, we'll see how the grades are falling out all together. I'm going to look at your complete body of work, sort of like the NCAA tournament selection people, right? So at the end of the season, we'll look at the complete body of your work, and then we'll see if there's a need to adjust the grades a little bit. Looking at the distribution from the first exam that I see right now, I don't think there's that much of a need for a curve. So if I based final exams, if I based final grades on these scores, it's probably the cutoffs that are in the syllabus are the ones that I'd be using. Okay? All right. Anything else you want me to talk about with respect to the test? Then let's get to work. The next exam is going to be focused on things that I'm going to start talking about now. All right? So it's not going to be cumulative per se, but I think you're going to find out over the course of the next couple of weeks that I'll be referring back to things that we've talked about earlier in the class as well. So in that sense, the next exam might be a little bit cumulative, but my focus for the next test will be on the things that I've talked about starting right now. And the first thing that we're going to talk about for the next test is, in a word, thermodynamics, the energy, particularly as it's stored within cells. There is a discipline within chemistry called thermodynamics. It's all about energy. Believe me, I know you can take years of classes on thermodynamics. It's a rich, deep area, very math intensive, lots of calculus. I absolutely hated thermodynamics, but I had like 3 years of thermodynamics, graduate level thermodynamics and the rest. You guys are going to be the beneficiaries of my 3 years of suffering. I'm going to give to you today the essence of thermodynamics that's important to biology, and I don't think it's too painful at all. I think you may actually enjoy what we'll be talking about with respect to the energy as it's used and stored within cells. Where we're going with all this is there. You guys know what that is? That's a map of all of the different chemical pathways, the chemical reactions that take place in a simple organism called E. coli. All right, so this is, prokaryote, eukaryote, simple, complex. That's as simple as metabolism can get, right? That's E. coli's metabolism. Each of those lines is a different chemical pathway. Each of the little blips on the lines are chemicals that are intermediary compounds or the final compounds that are being made. The line connecting each of those is between them is a little word that's written in. That's the name of the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction. In a word, the sum total of all of the chemical reactions that take place inside of a living cell, we call that metabolism. That's what we're talking about for the next, 2-3 weeks in this class. And don't freak out. You don't need to memorize all of this stuff. But what I'm going to be drawing your attention to, see that red box in the middle there? We'll zoom in on that. This circle over here is something that I'll allude to a number of times. Let's get that circle there. That's the citric acid cycle. We'll talk about that, I think, a week from today. We'll be looking at different little pieces of this, and I show this to you right now just to try to impress upon you that this is a fairly vast subject in and of itself. Right? So even in a simple organism, metabolism, there's lots and lots of chemical reactions that are going on. All of those chemical reactions are following the same rules that chemical reactions have to follow outside of living cells. They're all playing with the same sort of thermodynamic principles that govern all chemical reactions, not just those inside of a cell. But these are the chemical reactions that living things choose to foster, to facilitate, to help take place within them. And so, as I said, we're going to zoom in on that red box. This is energy metabolism. Right down there is the citric acid cycle. This is glycolysis running through here, so you get a little bit of a clearer picture of what's going on here. Again, each of those dots is a different chemical compound. The lines connecting them is a chemical reaction. Each of those lines is catalyzed by a different enzyme. There's something wondrous that's happening here, and I don't think I'm going to be able to effectively convey to you my own wonder, my own amazement at this, but let me preface it. I'm going to start tearing up here. This is a big deal, right? Let me tell you something. Again, the essence of it is this, is that you've got the same rules that govern these chemical reactions, that govern all chemistry, living, non-living. It's all following the same rules. What makes living things different than non-living things in terms of the chemistry that they're carrying out is living things are facilitating. They're making it easier for some chemical reactions to take place than they would have been in the absence of those facilitators. The facilitators are enzymes. The chemistry inside of a living cell is different than the chemistry outside of a living cell, not because there's some special sets of rules, not because different chemical reactions can take place inside relative to outside. It's because living things make it easier for the reactions that they like to occur and give a pass to the reactions that they don't like. The only chemical reactions that take place, living or non-living, are spontaneous chemical reactions. We'll talk about what makes a reaction spontaneous. Living things say, gee, there's a bunch of different spontaneous reactions that could take place here. I like this one. I'm going to help this one play out, and I'm not going to do anything to help these other dozens of alternative chemical reactions. Right? I like this one. And because it prefers some over the others, and it settles on and it helps some, what ends up happening is the net chemistry, the total amount of chemistry, the reactions that are going on inside of cells, is really quite different than the reactions that are going on in non-living systems. It's not because they're following different rules, it's because living things have chosen, you could say deliberately, it would be a misanthropomorphism, but they have deliberately chosen for some reactions to occur relative to others. As I was driving in this morning, I was trying to think of an analogy that might help you guys appreciate this, right? And I don't know if this is the best analogy. I probably need you guys to help me coming up with a better analogy. Maybe this would be the basis for a good exam question. But here's my first pass at an analogy that I think might convey what's going on here. As I was driving in, I'm listening to songs that I'm playing off of my new iPhone, right? I got a playlist. And funny thing with my playlist, you can learn a lot about a person from looking at their playlist, right? Learn a lot about a person from looking at the books on their bookshelf. You can just imagine the kind of music that would be on my playlist, right? Just think of it. It probably would freak you out if you stopped and you really knew what was on my playlist. But I got a playlist, and I got about 100 songs on my playlist. Here's where the analogy starts to kick in. There's spontaneous changes that happen to my playlist because I have two daughters who modify my playlist. They take songs off, they put songs on. It's sort of like this baseline sort of background level of changes to my playlist. 2-3 songs added, 2-3 songs deleted every day. But it's still my playlist. I spend more time modifying the playlist. I put like 10 songs on and I take 10 songs off every day. The net result is that my playlist of 100 songs has a couple of clinkers in there that I would just as soon not be on my playlist. I don't want them coming up during the course of random play, but oh, well, you know, how much can I slap down my kids for changing my playlist, right? They think they're helping me, right? Putting, Dad, you're really going to like this song. Yeah, right. Well, I'll like it until I figure out when I have a chance to take it off my playlist, right? And I put other songs that I find that I like onto my playlist, or as the seasons change or whatever. The net result is that my playlist of 100 songs is pretty much all the songs that I want because I've facilitated them. I've helped those songs get on, but I've still got a couple other things that are sort of slipping in the same way that's going on within metabolism. Living cells are facilitating some reactions. There are other reactions that are happening not because they've been facilitated by the living thing, by enzymes and such, but just because they're happening in the background anyway. So those are the equivalent of my daughters adding songs and taking songs off of my playlist, but because I spend more time and I invest more energy putting things on and taking things off of the playlist, it's more my playlist than theirs. The general essence of the playlist is pretty cool, all right? So hopefully that analogy will help you a little bit. I expect you guys will be able to do better than I will in coming up with that analogy. So we're zooming in even a little further with this particular image. The last one didn't give you the names. It lets you see the dots now a little bit. There are a couple of molecules here. This is glucose 6-phosphate, pyruvate, acetyl-CoA. But you can see the dots and the lines connecting them. Again, those are supposed to be catalyzed chemical reactions. Now when you zoom right in, the dots get clever names like a compound named A, B, C, or D. It's the starting molecule. It's the product at the end of the process. And here a series of 3 different enzymes do sort of a bucket brigade. They take a molecule that's not particularly useful to a cell, and they change it into another molecule. Another enzyme picks up that other molecule that is still not particularly useful to a cell, changes it, hands it off to another enzyme. That enzyme takes that 3rd molecule, which is still not usually useful to a cell, and converts it into a molecule that the cell can actually use. Right? And we see this sort of chain of enzyme reactions taking place all the time throughout metabolism. This could be an amino acid. This could be a nitrogenous base. This could be a sugar. This could be ATP. The way that almost all of those molecules get made is through that sort of cascade, that series of chemical reactions. Sometimes it's a one-step process. Sometimes it's a two-step process. Sometimes it's a 15-step process where you need an enzyme at each step along the way to convert a substrate to a product that brings you closer ultimately to the molecule that the living thing needs. In the absence of these enzymes, all of these chemical reactions would have taken place of their own accord. Right? That's what we mean by spontaneous reactions. So a cell would start to accumulate some of this molecule, whatever it is, an amino acid, just by random chance. But it also would be accumulating dozens, maybe hundreds of other molecules like this that aren't particularly useful to the cell. The reason it accumulates more of this one than the hundreds of others that wouldn't be useful is because these reactions are facilitated by enzymes that speed up the rate at which those particular reactions take place, and nothing is done to help or to hinder the chemical reactions that the cell's not interested in. That's really the essence of what's going on. It's a really beautiful way for things to be running. You're not changing the rules, you're just greasing the skids a little bit for the reactions that you like. All right, so chemical energy in cells. That's what we're all about here. At the end of the day, we want to wrap our hands around this concept of metabolism. We're looking at the big picture today, the whole kielbasa. In lecture on Thursday, we'll talk about how molecules get broken down, catabolism. A week from today, we'll talk about the flip side, how molecules get built up, anabolism. Metabolism is the process by which molecules get broken down and built up. Catabolism plus anabolism. And again, we're going to do that, but let's start looking at the big picture and then hone in on some of the details. To really get a good feel for what's going on, let's do the thermodynamics discussion, because it's all governed by energy. It's all about energy. For prokaryotes, that's what life is all about. Prokaryotes that are capturing and storing and utilizing energy outcompete prokaryotes that aren't as good. That's what it all comes down to. For a prokaryotic organism like E. coli, nothing matters in anything close to the same way that energy does. For eukaryotes, we play a little bit of a different game, especially complicated eukaryotes like you and I. But even still for us, a lot of it comes down to energy. But for prokaryotes, it's all about energy. And energy, to a chemist, means thermodynamics. So let's talk about thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is an interesting discipline. It has some laws. Molecular biology, I'm a molecular biologist, by the way, we're proud that we have a dogma, right? It's the only scientific discipline that I'm aware of that has a dogma, the central dogma of molecular biology. I can't wait to talk with you about molecular biology's central dogma in about a month, right? But we'll save that for later. But thermodynamics is big into laws, and there are two laws in particular. The first law of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics that really govern the chemistry that takes place either within or without living cells. The first law of thermodynamics is spelled out right here. It's simply this: energy can't be created or destroyed. All right? To put it even more simply, perhaps, and say the first law of thermodynamics is all about conservation of energy. You know, oddly enough, it was actually Albert Einstein that first really hammered down this first law of thermodynamics. He said that you can't change the total amount of energy or matter in a system. And he realized, through math, he was able to demonstrate that energy and matter are intraconvertible, that you can go back and forth between them. Not something that we worry about except inside of nuclear reactors or within suns. But there's a fixed amount, and you can't just spontaneously accrue energy. Right? You can't just be sitting still and all of a sudden get a big jolt of energy. That's not how things work. Energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. If a system has a lot of energy, it keeps that energy. If it doesn't have much energy, it never gets much energy. The only way that those things can change is when you broaden the scope of the system. Okay, so within a system, energy can't be created or destroyed. If you start, instead of talking about the system being within the confines of a cell, and now being within the confines of an organism, well, now, okay, we can get some energy to move from one part of the organism to another, but the organism's total amount of energy and total amount of matter can't change unless you change the scale of the system and start now talking about an ecosystem as opposed to an organism or as opposed to a cell. The thing is, within a closed space, if you define a particular unit of space, it can be whatever you like. It could be a cell, it could be an organ, it could be an organism. The amount of energy in that closed amount of space can't increase or decrease. It's got to stay the same. Okay? So, in other words, the energy of an isolated system is constant. That puts a dagger through the heart of people who think that they have created perpetual motion machines. All right? The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office actually has hundreds, thousands of patent applications a year. Every year for the last 100, 200 years, they've been getting patent applications from people who think that they've discovered a perpetual motion machine, a machine that runs forever without the input of any energy. And the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office doesn't even bother to read those patent applications. They read them superficially, just to the point where they can determine which of the first two laws of thermodynamics this particular contraption is violating. Right? 90% of them violate the first law of thermodynamics, and they have a rubber stamp that says patent application denied, violation of the first law. That's all it says, and they leave it up to the inventor to figure out the first law of what, because if they don't know about thermodynamics, they have no business messing around with perpetual motion machines. All right? But the first law of thermodynamics says you can't make energy out of nothing. I'll tell you a practical experience that I've had with the first law of thermodynamics. I used to live in downtown Dayton. There was an alley behind my garage to the next people. The people that were living across the alley from me didn't get it, they had no grasp whatsoever on the first law of thermodynamics. They thought that their car had a leak in its gas tank, because what would happen is they would start the engine up, they'd go inside, they'd make breakfast, get the car nice and warm, right? Have breakfast, take a shower, get the kids on the school bus, have a second breakfast, watch Oprah for a little while, and come out. I don't know, when's Oprah on? It's probably the afternoon. But so they've been at this for a long time. They'd come out, and their car would be out of gas. And they thought there must be a leak in the gas tank because, you know, all they did was start the car. They weren't driving, they weren't going anywhere, but it would run out of gas. And this would happen to them a couple times a week. Their car would run out of gas, just sitting back there. And they couldn't figure out there was no puddle of gas down there. And I had to explain to them, you know, an idling car is burning energy. You know, it's not like gasoline accrues into the gas tank, you know, from the atmosphere somehow while you're running the car, right? They're not, even though the car isn't moving, the car idling is burning through. The engine's running, it's revving, right? You can't have that sort of stuff taking place unless you're putting more energy into the system, right? Unless you're pumping gas in, that car can't run forever. They thought they could violate the first law of thermodynamics, apparently. All right? So that's the first law thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, guess what the second law is all about? We're cruising through this outline. In a couple words, the second law of thermodynamics is entropy increases. Okay? And the thing about the second law of thermodynamics, this one's kind of subtle, but the real crux, what's important to living things, is that this second law of thermodynamics, that entropy increases, really kicks in when you're talking about energy transfers. When you're trying to move a parcel of energy from one place to another place, or from one molecule to another molecule, or from one system to another system, that transfer invariably is accompanied by an increase in the disorder of the systems that you're talking about. Entropy is fancy talk for disorganization or disorder. Okay, that's what entropy means. If you move a chunk of energy from here to there, in the process, some of that energy is going to get sloshed out and increase the disorder of the system along the way. Okay? You can move energy from one place to another, but you do it knowing, if you're a cell or as an engineer, you move that energy, you know that in the process you're going to be increasing the disorder of the system, and that increase in the disorder of the system is going to come to you at a cost of some of that energy. Check this out. How long have engineers in Detroit been trying to perfect and fine-tune the internal combustion engine? What do you think, 100 years? Fair? You know, beginning with Henry Ford, perhaps, maybe a little before. 100-some years, engineers have been trying to get cars that can go as far as possible on a single gallon of gas. Right? What we're talking about here is an energy transfer. We're talking about transferring energy stored in the chemical bonds of hydrocarbons, gasoline. Right? That's where the energy is starting. It's stored in those covalent bonds of the hydrocarbon molecules. We want to move that energy from those covalent bonds to the car so that the car can go, so it can move. Right? That's the transfer we're talking about. How efficient, for those of you who haven't read the lecture notes, how efficient do you think that energy transfer is? They've worked at it. Smart folks, lots of smart folks, with a serious financial incentive, have worked at this for about 100 years. The most efficient internal combustion engine that has been devised to date is 25% efficient. 25% of the energy stored in the hydrocarbon, the covalent bonds of the gasoline molecules, 25% of that can be transferred to the car to make the car go. What happens to the other 75%? It's lost as heat, lost as internal, it's lost as disorder to the system, increase in the temperature of the manifold, the exhaust, the outside of the car, maybe a little bit gets into the car to heat it up a little bit. 75% of that energy is lost when you try to transfer energy from hydrocarbons to the motion of a car. How about that? 100 years. That's the best that we've been able to come up with. There have been big improvements. The very first internal combustion engines were about 0.5% efficient, right? So we've gone from 0.5% to 25%. How much better could you get? Right? 100% would be what we're shooting for, right? 100% violates the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says some of that energy, at least a little bit, has to be lost as increased disorder. I'm telling you that the tax, the entropy tax that nature levies on us when we're transferring that energy from gasoline to the motion of a car is 75%. And we kind of just accept that, because for about 10, 20 years, people have been saying maybe 25% is as good as it's going to get. How about that? So this is true for internal combustion engines. You know what? It's also the second law of thermodynamics makes a very compelling case in favor of being a vegetarian. Okay? I'm not a vegetarian. Intellectually, I understand. It makes good sense to be a vegetarian. This is part of why it makes good sense to be a vegetarian. Where does the energy that makes us move around come from? Ultimately, it's from sunlight. There are some chemoautotrophs that live in the bottom of the ocean. I'm not getting any ATPs from them, right? I'm getting my ATPs from plants that have captured sunlight and taken those photons and used it to make carbohydrates, right? Now, I could get that by directly eating. I could steal those carbohydrates by directly eating the plant, having a piece of lettuce or spinach, right? I'll steal that organism's carbohydrates and the energy that it's stored. When I take their glucose molecules and I use that to drive my own chemical processes to make ATPs or maybe just to make more glucose sometimes, there's a loss of energy because of the second law of thermodynamics. There's like a 32% efficiency for those transfers. 2/3 of the energy of that spinach gets lost as heat when I eat the spinach and try to use its energy. How much worse is it when we put something in between me and the spinach, right? What if we have a pig eat the spinach before I eat the pig? The pig loses 2/3 of the energy because of the second law of thermodynamics, and then I lose 2/3 of the pig's energy because of the second law of thermodynamics. What if we have the pig eat ground up chicken parts, which apparently happens? We've just made the process all the worse. You know, and cows are the same sort of thing. I mean, you could feed a lot more people. You could keep the metabolic engines of a lot more people running if people ate plants as opposed to eating the things that ate the things that ate the plants. That's a pretty compelling argument for the world being a vegetarian sort of population. It all comes down to the second law of thermodynamics. So you've all seen dye molecules mixing with water molecules. Give them some time. This is an ordered system, right? There's a lot of blue stuff up here and a lot of yellowish stuff down there. Given time, those things spontaneously become more disordered, more of a random mix. Same is with this. I suppose it's possible that you could take a guy, hey, I should have worn jeans today. I could have looked like that guy. How about that? Take off the vest, put on some jeans, and here I could do the brick trick. You know, if I had a stack of bricks and I'm throwing bricks into two piles, I suppose there's some small chance that the bricks could assemble themselves into a ball, an ordered system. It could happen. Much, much more likely, my bricks are going to be a random pile of bricks when I'm throwing them into another pile. Right? Again, we're talking here about disorder versus order, entropy versus lack of entropy. Okay? And so we got this whole business of thermodynamics with its two laws. Energy must be conserved, and entropy must increase whenever you try to transfer energy from one place to another. Put those things together, and now we're in a position to start talking seriously about what makes a reaction a spontaneous reaction as opposed to a non-spontaneous reaction. Chemical reactions that take place of their own accord are spontaneous reactions. You could make an argument that all reactions are spontaneous because they can't happen otherwise. But there are some little twists that we'll talk about here. But let's get a mathematical framework to talk about spontaneous reactions. Ultimately, again, it's all governed by energy. And it becomes convenient at this point to introduce a concept called Gibbs free energy. There's this guy named Gibbs who had this bright idea that within a closed system, there's a finite amount of energy, right? And we can wrap our hands around it and we can talk about it. We can talk about how much energy is in the system. So there's this Gibbs free energy. It's the total amount of energy in the system. What is it that comes together? What things do you have to add together before you can say this is all the energy in the system? Well, Gibbs had this insight that there's really only two kinds of energy in the system that you need to keep your eye on. One of those types of energy is the energy that's stored in the chemical bonds of the system. That's called the enthalpy, E-N-T-H-A-L-P. It's the energy stored in the bonds, the chemical bonds of the system. So there's energy there. Where else is there energy? The other place there's energy, that's the first law of thermodynamics, ultimately. Where else is there energy? The other place that you have energy is in the order or the disorder of a system. A house of cards, stacked up, nice, neat, pretty, right, standing by itself. There's a lot of order associated with a house of cards. That means there's a lot of energy there. And so the order or the disorder of the system, the extent to which the system is ordered, is another reflection of how much energy is in the system. So the math works out like this. The Gibbs free energy, usually abbreviated G for Gibbs, is equal to the enthalpy of the system, usually abbreviated, you're expecting me to say E, aren't you? It's actually H. So the Gibbs free energy, G, equals H minus the amount of disorder in the system, the entropy, abbreviated S. I don't know where these chemists come up with this stuff. So let me give you the actual formal equation, and we'll backfill what some of the symbols mean. G equals H minus T times S. T is temperature. S is the disorder in the system. The warmer the system is, the greater effect that has on the disorder. H is the enthalpy. It's the energy stored in the covalent bonds. So the total amount of energy is ultimately determined by how much energy is in chemical bonds and how much disorder there is in the system, modified to some extent by the temperature. G equals H minus TS. So that's the Gibbs free energy. For a chemical reaction to be spontaneous, what must happen is you go from a high value for G at the start to a low value of G. That's the only way a chemical reaction can occur spontaneously. Go from high energy to lower energy. It doesn't matter if your decrease in the Gibbs energy comes because of a decrease in the enthalpy or an increase in the disorder or both, right? But to be spontaneous, you must go from high Gibbs free energy to low Gibbs free energy, high G to low G. Let's see if I have some pictures that help with this. You know what? I really dislike this picture, and each year I keep thinking I'm going to take this out of this PowerPoint, but it does sort of make a practical example of what's going on here. You get to see some people in bathing suits, which is always fun. The point here is really simple, though, right? Which of those two divers, the one standing on the board or the one jumping in or the one in the water, which of these three divers has the most energy associated with it? You know, the point here is pretty much this. The guy on the top of the board is supposed to make you think, ooh, that guy's got some nice Gibbs-free energy, right? Look at him. He's just oozing Gibbs-free energy. The one down there in the water, oh, man, her Gibbs-free energy is not that much to look at, is it? Because she's go from high to low, okay? Here's a little more serious representation of what I've just been talking with you about, though. Again, for a reaction to be spontaneous, for a chemical reaction to be spontaneous, you need to go from a high value of G down ultimately to a low value of G. Okay? things that are equated with a high value of G, a high Gibbs free energy, those systems tend to be less stable. And there's more of a capacity for them to do some sort of useful work, right? I mean, these are not profound concepts, I don't think. Yeah, if I had a lot of energy, I could probably do more, right? It applies to humans just as it applies to chemical systems. Things without much free energy can't do as much work, and they tend to be pretty stable. Seriously, a random pile of bricks, not much capacity to do anything with a random pile of bricks, but by the same token, it's pretty stable. Right? If there's an earthquake, if somebody kicks it, the random pile of bricks isn't going to be that much different after the earthquake than it was before the earthquake, or after the kicking as opposed to before the kicking. A nice brick wall, lots of energy stored in that system, less stable, more likely to convert into something else during the earthquake or a good hard kick. And so now we can talk about this in a couple of different ways. So we've got this sort of broad picture of Gibbs free energy. We've even managed to explore how Gibbs free energy might apply to divers, right, in the sense of gravitation. We've done a passing, I've talked with you in passing at least about this idea of diffusion, right? This is another example where you have at the top here, you've got a picture with the little purple balls all clustered together, right? That's a greater work capacity. It's not as stable as what you have down here where there's less work capacity, and it's a more stable system because this is just a random assemblage of the balls. The chance that they would all come together by themselves is relatively small. It's unstable. It's prone to dissipating, diffusing into this. And now let's talk about it from the perspective of molecules. Here, the black again is shorthand for carbon, the red for oxygen, the grayish things are hydrogens. Here you've got a cluster of atoms all grouped together, right? There's some order to this. There is some capacity to do work because of the energy stored in the covalent bonds. The expectation is that you would go from a high Gibbs free energy to a low Gibbs free energy where these molecules are separated and sort of diffusely spread out in a mix as opposed to all clustered together. So this is going to be true. This Gibbs free energy idea applies across all of these different kinds of systems. Obviously, now we're going to talk pretty seriously about what's going on with the chemical reactions where we go from high Gibbs free energy to lower Gibbs free energy. So energy inside of cells all comes down to pretty much two molecules. So cellular energy becomes relevant when you talk about either glucose or ATP. And I've already told you guys at some length, excuse me, that glucose is more or less the equivalent, what did I say, of a $100 bill, right? In your wallet or your purse. It's nice to have feels good to have a $100 bill in your wallet. Just nice to know. That's sitting back there waiting for you if you need it. Glucose is a big chunk of change. You can do a lot of stuff as a living thing with a glucose molecule. Practically speaking, it turns out that the $100 bill doesn't get you very far with a vending machine. A $1 or a $5 bill serves you a lot better in that sort of context. That's where ATP comes in. Okay, so we got these two currencies. One currency, two denominations for energy within cells. You usually think either in terms of glucose or in terms of ATP. You guys know about glucose. We've talked about glucose a fair bit already in this class. Let me show you one of your favorite shrimp. I meant to show you. I have kids. I watch SpongeBob a lot. So this is the G-rated version of this class. Come back tonight and we'll do the PG if you like. Here's what glucose looks like. Right? You guys have seen glucose before. You're old friends with glucose. You spent a lot of time hanging out with these structures. These are 4 different ways to talk about glucose. Let's just look at this one here. This is probably the easiest one to wrap our heads around. Check it out. That's glucose, 6-carbon sugar, conveniently numbered, each carbon, right? 6 carbons. I've told you, I've emphasized to you, this is a high energy bond. There's a lot of sharing of the electron between these 2 carbon atoms. The electrons involved with this covalent bond are pretty equidistant. They're far removed from the atomic nucleus for the carbon. They're high up there in the altitude, if you like to think. They're far away from the center of the atom. Those are high energy bonds. The same is true for this one over here. That's a high energy bond. Here, well, not so much. But nonetheless, there's a lot of high energy bonds over here. Check this out. You know how much energy is stored in a glucose molecule? It is huge. 686 kcal per mole. I just know that off the top of my head, partly because I looked at the lecture notes, but just because I happen to know that, because it left such an impression on me. I don't expect you guys to memorize that number, but I want you to have an appreciation of how profound that number is. 686 kcal per mole. The K is short for 1,000 kilocalories. All right, so it's 686,000 calories per mole. What's a mole? It's an Avogadro's number, 6 times 10 to the 27th? 23rd. Oh, come on, between friends, a couple orders of magnitude. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's a big number. It's about a pound of sugar, okay? Right? When you work it out, you figure out the atomic weights of glucose molecules. A pound of sugar is about a mole of sugar. Within a pound of sugar, 686,000 calories. Okay? All right? Remember the definition? Do you remember the definition of a calorie? It's the amount of energy that's needed to increase the temperature of a milliliter of water 1 degree centigrade. Milliliter of water, kind of a small thing. In a pound of sugar, there's enough energy to increase the temperature of that water from room temperature to 686,000 degrees. Whoa! I mean, that's serious energy. There's a lot of energy available, stored in the bonds, the enthalpy, the energy stored in the covalent bonds of a sugar molecule. That's a huge chunk of change from the perspective of a cell's energy budget, 686,000 kcals per mole. And that's in contrast to ATP. Here's what ATP looks like. Okay? ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine is something that you guys have encountered before. It is that nitrogenous base in the upper right-hand side of the screen. It's one of the 4 nitrogenous bases that you find as part of DNA molecules. Right? So it's that same adenine. It's the adenine attached to a ribose sugar, just like it would be inside of a nucleotide, just as it would be in a nucleic acid. And also on that ribose sugar, instead of 1 phosphate like you would see in a nucleotide chain, there are 3, hence the T, ATP, adenosine tri for 3 phosphates. When you guys see phosphates, I hope you still wake up in the middle of the night with a dream where a phosphate made a random appearance and you find yourself saying negative. Right? That happens to all of you, right? I didn't sleep well last night. I had a lot of these phosphates popping up, and I kept jumping out of bed saying, negative, negative. Putting those negative charges next to each other isn't easy to do. Nature likes to have separation of charges. It doesn't want to have a negative charge right next to a negative charge, right next to another negative charge, let alone these phosphate groups where one of them is going to have 2. That's not a happy molecule. That's an unstable molecule from a from a nature perspective, from a Gibbs free energy perspective. The clustering of those negative charges, those covalent bonds, to pull that off have to have some energy associated with them. And the way that cells get energy out of ATP is by doing nature a favor and letting one of those phosphates go somewhere else, going from ATP to ADP, adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate with an inorganic phosphate that floats off somewhere else. There's energy stored in that bond. That's where I want to go with this. The energy stored in that bond, when you talk about how much energy is in an ATP molecule, practically speaking, it's the energy stored in that bond. That is 7.2 kcals per mole. Right? So I've been kicking around numbers like a $100 bill and a $5 bill and a $1 bill. I don't know, you guys do the math now. 686 kcals per mole for glucose versus 7.2 kcals per mole for ATP. Between friends, that's probably a $100 bill and a $1 bill. Glucose relative to ATP. Here's where the Gibbs free energy thing really starts to be kind of interesting, though. I was giving the engineers in Detroit some bad lip service, 15 minutes ago, talking about how pathetic their 25% efficiency of transfer of energy from hydrocarbons to the motion of my car is, right? Yeah? I think that's not so good. How much better has nature done? When you convert glucose to ATP, where does ATP come from? ATP comes from forcing a phosphate group onto ADP, right? How much energy does it take to do that? 7.2 kcals per mole. Where does that 7.2 kcals per mole come from? It comes from burning glucose. By getting the energy out of glucose, you can drive that reaction to make more ATP. How efficient do you suppose that reaction is? 10%. How many ATPs could you make from a glucose molecule? How many ATP molecules could be made from one glucose molecule? 686 kcals per mole, 7.2 kcals per mole. Do the math, right? It's what, 90-ish, right? In principle, you should be able to make 90-ish ATPs from one glucose molecule. In practice, evolution, working at this problem diligently for about 2 billion years, has managed to eke out, to negotiate a contract of sorts with nature that allows it to convert 32, sometimes 34 ATPs from ADP and inorganic phosphate for every glucose that is consumed. About 35% efficiency. That's what a killer the second law of thermodynamics is. You know, when we talk about increase of entropy with the transfer of energy, I mean, this is a serious, heavy tax that nature imposes on living things that want to do those types of energy transfers. The best, and this is one of the single most important reactions that living things participate in, the best that living things have been able to negotiate over billions of years is about 35% efficiency. And it doesn't get better than that. So when you're talking about how good might we hope the engineers in Detroit might be able to get an engine, give them another billion years and they may be able to move it to 35% from 25%, but to expect anything more is probably unrealistic. How about that? So these are the molecules. Oh, let me just, in case this isn't clear, right? You know, I have so many opportunities to do product placement in this class, right? Let me tell you, I bank at Wright Pat Credit Union, right? You know, you should too, right? You know, why doesn't I should get some kickback for that, shouldn't I? But I do my banking at Wright Pat Credit Union, right? I think I would change my bank if I went to Wright Pat Credit Union with a $100 bill, right? And they gave me back 32 singles, right? It's like, you know, how would you feel about this exchange, right? You know, I find the $100 bill I have doesn't work that well in vending machines. I'd like some $1 bills, please. Here you go. They count out, here you are, sir, your $32 right back for you. It's like, wait a minute here, 132, I know some math. There's a difference between these. Shouldn't I be getting more? Sorry, that's the exchange rate that we're working with here. I mean, that's how horrible this deal is. That's how stiff the transaction fee is that nature imposes because of that second law of thermodynamics. Right? That's what's going on here, folks. It's a huge deal. So let's go back a couple slides here and talk about this. For a reaction to be spontaneous, free energy is fancy talk for Gibbs free energy. You could just put G there. Right? If you have a spontaneous reaction, what you have is you're going from reactants that have a high value for G, to products that have a low value for G. There's a net change in the Gibbs free energy. You go from high G to low G. And energy gets released. Here, most of that energy is probably going to be released as disorder to the system, increase in temperature, that sort of thing. That's a spontaneous reaction. That's an energy-releasing reaction. Notice spontaneous. You could call that an exergonic reaction. Or, for simplicity, you could call it a spontaneous reaction. That's in contrast to an endergonic reaction, or a reaction that's not spontaneous, where you need to invest energy to get the process to take place. A non-spontaneous reaction is one where you go from reactants that have a low free energy, a low G, to products that have a high free energy, a high G. To do that, you have to invest energy. Okay? Non-spontaneous. How does that ever happen? Well, it happens because you're investing energy into the process. You know where that energy comes from? That energy comes from spontaneous reactions. And so the trick that living things have figured out pretty well is to get some reactions to take place that are not energetically favorable. They link those reactions, they pair them, they couple them to chemical reactions that are energetically favorable. So how do you make ATP? I've already told you, you do it by burning glucose. Nature loves burning glucose, releasing all that energy, breaking all those high energy bonds. Oh my gosh, that's a dream come true for nature. Right? And so the deal that's been worked out is this, is living things have said to nature at the negotiating table, and it turns out we'd really like to have some ATP. It would be very convenient if we had some ATP. And nature comes back and says, I'm afraid I don't like ATP. I'm not going to help you with that. ATP is it's on our bad list of molecules. It's high in energy. It's unstable. I don't like ATP. It's like, how about this, though? You really don't like glucose either, do you? It's like, oh, man, no, glucose, that's a bad molecule. Man, no, I hate glucose. Let's do this. I'll help you break up a glucose, nature, if you'll help me make an ATP. And nature says, ooh, I don't know. I guess I could be persuaded. It's like, how about if you let me make 2 ATPs? I'd really rather just make 1 ATP. How about 100 ATPs? No, that's not going to happen. And the negotiation works out to ultimately, okay, 32, maybe 34 under some special circumstances, depending on what my mood's like at the time. The way that we make ATP molecules is by coupling that unfavorable chemical reaction to a much more favorable chemical reaction from the energetics perspective. So we make ATPs by linking more spontaneous reactions to the less non-spontaneous reactions that we want to drive. That's the trick. That's the game that we're playing. Again, here are those structures. High energy molecule here. Pretty high energy, but not as high as glucose. And the way you release that energy from an ATP is through hydrolysis. You kick out the inorganic phosphate, and you make ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And then check out these different chemical reactions. So we've got a reaction here that is, the delta G is positive. I can tell you just at a glance, if the change in the Gibbs free energy is positive, that means you went from low free energy to high free energy. Not going to be happening spontaneously. But what you can do is you can couple this non-spontaneous reaction. Let's just say, for whatever reason, we need this molecule called glutamine. It's not going to happen in and of itself, not very likely because of the change in free energy. But what living things can do is they can couple this chemical reaction to the hydrolysis of ATP. And if you remember, 7.3 kcals per mole for each ATP versus 3.4 kcals per mole for each glutamine. Net, you link those two reactions together, the delta G is negative. For the total of the two, nature's going to let that happen. It turns out that's a relatively efficient transfer of the energy. About 50% of that energy got captured during the course of that particular chemical reaction. All right. Look at this. We're at the point where I can talk with you about enzymes. Boy, enzymes are so cool. There's so much neat stuff that I could talk with you about. I can't do it justice in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try. All right, so bear with me for a little while longer, and I'll probably pick up a little bit with some of the ways that enzymes get regulated at the beginning of lecture on Thursday. But here, check it out. We got an energy-rich molecule called methane on the left, and we can release the energy in methane literally by burning it with oxygen, converting the methane to CO2 with energy and water molecules. This is combustion. That's what it's all about. That's a very spontaneous reaction. And a convenient way to think about the energetics associated with these spontaneous reactions is this. When you look at this, right, there's okay, I hate to be the one to break it to you. There's methane in this room, and I know where it's coming from, all right? And it's not for me. I'm confident of that. But there's methane in this room. There's oxygen in this room. That's a spontaneous chemical reaction. Why doesn't the methane and the oxygen get together and poof in this room? The reason it doesn't happen, the reason that spontaneous reaction doesn't occur is because even though going from methane and oxygen to carbon dioxide and water is energetically favorable, to get from the reactant state to the product, you have to pass through a more excited state that's called the transition state. You actually have to invest some energy in both of those molecules. And that energy is called the activation energy. You get that activation energy back. It's an investment, but you kind of have to destabilize the system. You have to heat it up. You have to have the molecules come and collide with each other at a certain speed. You have to have a certain amount of vibration between the atoms and the methane and the oxygen. You have to juice the system up a little bit, prime the pump, if you will. Okay? Almost all chemical reactions, spontaneous chemical reactions, need to pass through that sort of transition state before you can get the payoff that gives you that favorable release of energy, where you also get back the activation energy. So you get a very good return on that investment. Here's the thing that enzymes do, and that enzymes do so spectacularly well. The way that enzymes facilitate some chemical reactions is by lowering those chemical reactions' activation energies, by reducing the amount of energy you need to invest to prime the pump to get the ball rolling in the first place. That is all that enzymes do. They reduce the activation energy for specific chemical reactions that they want to facilitate. That's the magic. That's the trick that enzymes have. It's all about reducing the activation energy, like this. Okay? And so here's the course of the reaction without an enzyme shown in black. Here's the course of the reaction with a catalyst, with an enzyme shown in red. That's it. That's all that the enzyme does. It reduces the activation energy. Now, how it reduces the activation energy is kind of cool and slick and clever and all that, but it all comes down to reducing the activation energy. Reducing the activation energy for a chemical reaction is a big stinking deal. Reducing the activation energy translates directly into speed, the rate with which substrates or reactants get converted to products is much faster with a reduced activation energy than with a non-reduced activation energy. How much faster, you ask? It's typically thousands of times faster. And in some spectacular instances, like carbonic anhydrase, which is specifically mentioned in the lecture notes, you can get the exact number in catalase. The exact numbers are in the lecture notes. In some spectacular instances, the reduction in the activation energy results in a million-fold increase in the rate with which the chemical reaction takes place. Think back to my analogy about my playlist, right? My daughters are changing my playlist daily, 2 or 3 songs added, 2 or 3 songs removed, sort of background noise kind of things. I'm a piker compared to these enzymes. I'm just barely making a dent in the system by changing 10 or so a day, right? 5 times the rate at which my daughters are changing my playlist. If I wanted to be a good copycat off of an enzyme, I'd be swapping out 100 or 1,000 songs on my 100-song playlist every day. What effect is that 2 or 3 that my daughters are changing each day going to have if I'm going at that kind of clip in terms of monitoring and changing my playlist? I would totally dominate my playlist. Living things totally dominate, control the chemicals that are present inside of them, not by changing the laws of thermodynamics, but simply by reducing the activation energy of the reactions that result in products that they like, and not doing anything with regard to the reactions that aren't that interesting or important to them. They can't stop those spontaneous reactions from occurring, but they sure don't have to help them in terms of speed. So how does this play out? Well, it works out something like this. The way you reduce an activation energy as an enzyme is you bring the substrate into a nice, comfortable spot. Where do you suppose the active site? I told you when we first talked about proteins, it's usually really easy to identify an active site. Oh my gosh, there's the active site of this one. It turns out that this substrate nestles nicely into that spot, and the enzyme then, once it's there, sort of engulfs it, wraps around it even a little bit better, and then maybe starts tugging on it a little bit. Maybe there's something with some negative charge here that's attracted to some positive charge here, maybe some positive charge with some negative charge there, and you can sort of tease the molecule apart. That's the sort of strategy that enzymes take to reduce activation energies. There's a nice picture of it. I tell you what, let's not take the time to talk about inhibition right now. I'll do that with you guys on Thursday, but I want to leave you with this. This is a question that I'm going to put on your next exam. All right? So it'll be verbatim on the next test. What I'd like to do for the next several lectures when I have the time and I think of it is I'm going to sketch out a question to give you a sense of where I'm headed. And so don't freak out. There's still a couple minutes left of the class. Take a picture, write it down. But I'm going to put that question on word for word on the next test, and it'll give you something to sort of chew on between now and then to get a sense of how this stuff makes sense for a living system. Hey, I'm going to photobomb your pictures. How do I do that? All right. All right. We'll see you guys on Thursday.